Thank you, Matthias and Anne, for inviting me and to the organizing committee, and thank you to the Austrian Economic Association for having me here. I do have to start with a small anecdote, because when I was an undergraduate student in economics, I grew up in Colombia. My main interests were business cycles, and Schumpeter was a big part of what I was studying, so it was very exciting to hear that he was the founder of the Austrian Economic Association. Obviously, time passed and my research interests have changed. And I'm very honored to be here, to be able to talk about the political economy of forced migration, to think and reflect about the past 15 years of research. Not only my own research, but research that many others have done on the area of forced migration, including many people that are here in this conference. So what I'll do today, as Matthias hinted earlier, is I will be looking at three interconnected parts: labor markets, fiscal impacts, and public attitudes. And we heard earlier about migration being not new, right? People move all the time. They move within countries, across countries. They move for all sorts of different reasons, right? When we look at reasons for migration, there's students, there's economic migrants, there's family reunification, there's forced migrants. So people have been moving for a long, long time and for all sorts of different reasons. And when we look at international migration, which is defined as people born outside their country of birth, by 2024, the estimated number was about 304 million worldwide. Now, this has doubled since the 1990s, but it's around 3 to 4% of the population. So in that sense, it has remained constant. But my lecture today is going to be focused on a specific type of migration, what we call forced migration. And what forced migration is basically that movement, that displacement that is caused by persecution, conflict, violence, or human rights violations. So we're talking about, we typically hear about refugees, IDPs, asylum seekers, and others of concern. And within that, I'm going to be focusing on refugees, as I will tell you later. But forced migrants also include disaster-related displacement, which is something that's becoming more and more prominent in the last couple of years. So the type of migrants I will be talking about are those that are sort of under the umbrella of international frameworks, such as the 1951 Refugee Convention and the 1967 Protocol, and the guiding principles of internal displacement. By the end of 2024, there were about 123 million forcibly displaced people worldwide because of conflict, and about 9.8 million because of disaster-related displacement. And this is generally has to do with climate change or other types of disaster displacement. The numbers have tripled since 2010, and just to give you a sense of what the categories that we have in here, the majority of forcibly displaced migrants are what we call the internally displaced population, or IDPs. And these are people that move within their own country, within their own country of birth because of conflict. And at the moment, it's in about 3.5 million, with 9.8 million IDPs due to disaster-related or disaster-induced reasons. To give you a sense of where most internal displacement individuals are, about 51% originate from 5 countries: Sudan, Syria, Colombia, the DRC, and Yemen. So you're probably not surprised to hear those in there. But, and in the map, I also have the disaster displaced in green, which is becoming more and more prominent, but also there's a lot of conflating factors that have to do with conflict and disaster-related events. But among those are Afghanistan, Chad, the Philippines, Ethiopia, Somalia, and the DRC, which make up about 57% of the internally displaced people. When we think about other types of forced migrants, we can think about refugee and asylum seekers, and this is what my lecture is going to be mostly about today, and I'll explain why. which at the moment, by the end of 2024, it stands at 38.8 million refugees. A refugee is a person that has migrated to another country and has been given the status of refugee under the International Convention, and asylum seekers are those that are in another country also waiting to be recognized as refugees. There's other populations of concerns, and I won't talk much about those, but there's a lot of other people that have to move either within country or across country for many other reasons. They're stateless individuals, and these are people that under the UNHCR mandate, which is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, they keep track of what's happening with these displaced populations. So when it comes to refugees, about 70% come from just 5 countries. And those are from Venezuela, Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and South Sudan. So you might not be surprised to hear that many of them come from just a very few countries, but when we look at where they're located, where they're hosted, we see that they're hosted in not necessarily in high-income countries, right? They'll be in Iran, Turkey, Colombia, Uganda, and Germany is one of the features among the top hosting countries. Now, when you expand beyond the top 5 countries to the top 10 countries, they host about 57% of refugees, and very few of those are high-income countries. So just to give you a sense of why is it that I'm focusing on one type of forced migrants and not the other, when we look at internally displaced migrants, we see that they're mostly in low-income countries, and to some extent in middle-income countries, but very few in high-income countries. Now, this internal displacement is a whole literature on its own. There's lots of economists doing a lot of work, very important work in this area, but it's very specific. It's very specific to development problems, very specific to conflict studies, and as we heard earlier, it's becoming more and more interdisciplinary to understand the causes and impacts of conflict and disaster-related displacement. Now, when we look at where refugees are hosted, and remember, refugees are the ones that are displaced across countries, they're mostly in middle-income countries, but about 1/3 of them are in high-income countries. So again, this has implications for the way economists will approach these different problems. So, and this matters because obviously there's economic consequences of this forced displacement, right? There's consequences for the labor market in terms of impacts on hosting society, in terms of outcomes of refugees, but also on public finances, infrastructures, services, innovation, and growth potential. Today, I'm just going to focus on the first two, labor markets and public finances, and I'm going to try to reflect on what's been done in terms of research in the last 15 years. But we know that there's a connection to how people perceive these problems, right? These are headlines from the UK, recent headlines from just this year, where there's headlines trying to call attention into how the Home Office announces a nation blitz on asylum seekers taking jobs, how migrants are displacing the host from the workforce, or how migrants are draining the welfare system. And therefore, there's been much of my interest over the years has shifted also to the political economy of forced migration, because we know that public attitudes matter not only for the way we conduct policy, but also for social cohesion and sort of long-term well-being, not only of the residents of countries, but also the migrants themselves. So before I start with labor markets, what I'm going to give you is an overview of what's been done in the last 15 years, and I cite some of the papers, including some that I've done, but not all of them. So this is not exhaustive. Just want to acknowledge that there's been a lot of work in the last 10 years, and to give you a sense of why economists have finally stepped into the role of understanding the impacts of displacement. When we look at forced migration, they tend to be sudden population increases, right? So if you look at the Lebanon, Kenya, if you look at Poland, which is much more recent, or Colombia, there's a big influx of refugee migrants, meaning an increase in the labor supply, right? And an increase in the labor supply, it allows economies to be able to compare what happens before and after, right? What happens when there is an increase in the labor supply. And it's, in a way, methodologically more tractable than just looking at migration itself. Migration can happen endogenously in many ways. With forced migration, we have sudden population increases. So a lot of the literature on the labor market impacts of immigration has made the use of quasi-natural experiments, lots of differences, to try to look at what are the impacts on host societies. And there's been plenty of work in the last 15 years or so. And here I'm citing, there's 3 or 4 reviews that really capture what we know about the impacts of forced displacement in labor markets. And some of the findings, some of the stylized facts that we have now from the literature is that there's mixed employment and wage effects. Majority of studies have shown that there's a negative or no impact. But when there's negative effects were significant, they're mainly in the short run, in middle-income countries, and especially for women, younger workers, low-skilled and informal workers. Most of this evidence obviously comes from middle-income countries, Turkey, Colombia, and some Tanzania and Lebanon. But what the literature also finds is that these inflows often displace locals in low productivity or informal sectors, but can also increase employment in construction, in education, public services, and higher skill occupations. There's naturally an adjustment over time, right? These negative wage effects tend to dissipate and disappear in the longer run because refugees often don't come on their own, right? They come with aid, they come with more public spending, and there's the creation of local jobs. And as economies reallocate and attract new firms, long-run outcomes are often neutral or positive. Now, historical evidence has shown that, or historic episodes has shown impacts in terms of innovation, right? Historic episodes like the Huguenots in Prussia, Jewish scientists in the US have shown that forced migrants can boost productivity, industrial diversification, and innovation. In a nutshell, and I sort of hate doing this because I believe in nuance, but what we know about labor market impacts is that there's clear winners and losers, right? And these winners and losers, or these losers can be, the impact can be moderated through policy. But the high-skilled formal workers, firms and consumers often benefit from this increase sudden increases in the population of forced migrants, but low-skilled natives, informal workers, may face initial competition unless offset by policy measures. So this is kind of in a nutshell what the evidence has shown us in terms of labor market impacts of forced migration. But how about outcomes? Interestingly, when we look at outcomes of refugees, most of the literature doesn't come from where these refugee migrants live or where they're hosted. Most of the literature comes from refugees in high-income countries and some middle-income countries like Colombia, and I'll explain why Colombia. But the main reason is that they have comprehensive administrative data and representative surveys, right? You take a country like Denmark, in which you can have administrative data about every single individual in the country. You can look at labor market outcomes over time and compare refugee outcomes to other migrants or to the natives. So it's not a surprise that even though high-income countries host a third of the refugee migrants, most of the evidence that we have in terms of outcomes comes from these countries. And again, I'm trying to sort of think about the stylized facts in this literature. What are the main findings? And some of the main findings in here show that refugees do have lower employment and entry, right? They have lower employment rates than economic migrants and natives during the first years of arrival. There's occupational downgrading. Refugees often accept jobs below their skill and education level, especially, again, in the first years. And there's kind of a tendency also to engage in self-employment or informality. They're more likely to become self-employed and remain in informal jobs, even after obtaining the right to work. And this is going to be an interesting finding that I'll come back to later, because it's one of the puzzles that I think deserves a lot of research to start being done. What we find in terms of outcomes is that despite starting in a negative gap in terms of employment rates and wages, there's convergence over time. These employment gaps narrow gradually after a decade or so. And refugees often reach similar employment rates as natives, but the earnings gaps still exist. And some of the research that's coming out is trying to look at and understand those earning gaps. What can decrease those earning gaps? But potential explanations have to do with barriers to entry, right? Language, non-recognition of qualification, lack of host country experience, but also credit constraints. And this is going to be also, again, important when I circle back to the idea of refugees staying, or forced migrants staying in the informal sector. A really important aspect on trying to understand these differential effects comes from looking at health outcomes. And mental health is a big issue when you look at refugee migration. Remember that these are migrants that have been exposed to conflict, to violence, and all sorts of situations, with that added journey to come to the host country. And some research that's out there has found that trauma and poor mental health do reduce employment probabilities and earnings, which is exacerbated by some policies in the host country in which refugees or asylum seekers are isolated for a period of time before they're able to join the labor market. And there's obviously also a gender dimension to this. Refugee women face compounded barriers like childcare, limited networks, cultural norms. And so these gender aspects are also quite important when looking at the labor market outcomes of refugees. So we've looked at the impacts, we've looked at the outcomes. We know that most of the evidence that we have on outcomes comes from high-income countries, not necessarily where most refugees are displaced. But one question here, and if we're thinking about what can we do in high-income countries, is what are the policy levers that we can sort of think of when thinking about migrant integration? And there's been, again, in these last 15 years, an increase in the amount of research that's been done by economists and others, because I've seen an increase in multidisciplinarity from economists. And a lot of this research has found that early interventions yield higher returns. So policies in the first years of arrival can produce long-term gains in employment, earnings, and self-reliance. So evidence-based policy levers, the way the economists have tackled a lot of these questions have been through RCTs. There's been randomized controlled trials, trying to see what works to help refugees and migrants join the labor market or do well in the labor market. But there's also a lot of reception policies and other interventions that allows researchers to look at what works. And again, I'll come back to the example of Denmark, because there's been lots of research lately in terms of refugee migration in Denmark, where you have population-wide data in which you can follow the outcomes of refugees over time. And if there's a policy in the middle, then you can look at what the impacts of these policies are. But what are the policy levers that have been found to work. One is the right to work, right? Legal status matters. Granting legal work rights improves refugee incomes and consumption. Faster asylum decisions, early work rights. Jens Mueller, who's a political scientist that publishes also in economic journals, has found in a previous paper that each additional year of waiting for the right to work or for the refugee status to be given lowers subsequent employment rates. So faster asylum decisions can work in terms of integrating faster into the labor market. There's been very interesting literature on strategic placement, matching. Data-driven assignment of refugees to local areas has found to boost employment. And again, Alex Teitelbaum at Oxford has been working on matching algorithms, trying to have the preference of the host and the preference of refugee to match, and trying to maximize, make it more of a win-win situation, both for migrants and both for refugees and the host. It's been found also that social assistance matter. Restrictive policies can backfire. Recent work by Christian Dossmann and many of his collaborators have found that lowering welfare benefits, for example, trying to get refugees to access the labor market faster, can increase or can raise short-term participation in the labor market, but it comes at a high risk. It risks long-term harm, including higher crime rates, petty crimes, by the way, lower children's outcomes, and reduced female participation. So rethinking social assistance can be quite important when thinking about refugee integration in high-income countries. Obviously, addressing trauma raises employment probabilities and earnings. So mental health, seeing it as an economic factor, is quite important. And there's been some really interesting work also in the impact of early interventions, like intensive language and vocational training, bespoke job search assistance, coaching, and direct employer matching. Obviously, these things are costly, but as I said, sometimes refugees don't necessarily come alone. They can come from, with aid to support these interventions. So that leads me to the second part. So we've looked at the impact of forced migration in labor markets, where most of the evidence is in middle-income countries and few high-income countries. The labor market outcomes of refugees, which comes mostly from high-income countries, which host about a third of the forced displaced population. And we've looked at the policy levers that might work in high-income countries. But what about the fiscal impacts? It's one of these things that we keep hearing in the headlines about welfare use, whether whether immigrants or refugees overuse the welfare system. And at the beginning of this year, with two of my co-authors, one a sociologist, the other one a political scientist, we put together a paper trying to review the fiscal impacts of immigration, and we also look at the fiscal impacts of forced migration. And this was part of a whole issue on the future of the welfare state. In the UK, the future of the welfare state has been very contentious, trying to understand what's going to happen, if it's sustainable in the face of migration, and so on. And what we find is that, from other studies, is that migrants as a whole exert a neutral or positive effect on public finances in host countries, specifically when we're talking about what we call economic migrants. Right? They pay their way into the system. Refugees, by contrast, often begin with a small negative fiscal balance due to reception costs and temporary dependence on social protection. But these deficits are generally modest relative to GDP and tend to balance out and become positive over time as refugees enter the labor market, pay taxes, and stimulate demand. One thing to remember here as well is that economic migrants and refugee migrants are different, right? So refugee migrants are under an international convention, so when they're hosted, there's an underlying understanding that they'll come with certain costs. And so most of these negative impacts on fiscal impacts come from these front-loaded costs, right? Initial spending on shelter, education, social protection, which are higher in the first years of arrivals, but age, skill profile of arrivals, and labor market access and policy design can lead to better and faster integration, right? So in the longer term, as refugee integrates in the labor market, tax revenues and consumption grow, offsetting these initial costs. Just to give you an example, refugees in the US reach fiscal neutrality after 8 to 10 years. Michael Clemens, who's an economist, he just changed his institution, so I don't remember where he's at, but did a really interesting work on the impact of Trump's decrease in resettlement quotas. Most of the refugees that are hosted in the US are not necessarily the same as in other countries, as most of them come through a resettlement process, which is a whole different aspect I won't get into. But in Colombia also, Colombian regularization of Venezuelans has raised tax and consumption, right? So I'll talk about the Colombian case in a little bit, but there's been about 2.8 million Venezuelans coming into Colombia, and there's been an amnesty in which most of them have been given the right to work, the right to formal work. So, and this is kind of my reflection as I was putting together this lecture. We know a lot about labor market integration. We have a sense of what the stylized facts are of increased population shocks and how in the long term, so if we think in terms of general equilibrium, these tend to disappear and can become positive. There's many aspects of labor market integration that can lead to sort of positive impacts on the host and can be managed through policies for those that are affected negatively. We also know that we can achieve fiscal sustainability for refugees given the right policies. But it's 2025 and we still see a lot of headlines about welfare misuse, about taking jobs and so on. So as I was writing this, I started thinking that there seems to be a discourse gap. And what explains that discourse gap? And consciously, then I understood why about 5 or 7 years ago, I started moving more towards the study of the political economy of migration and trying to understand public attitudes and the political space, right? So we know that there's short negatives, long positives, and there's a discourse gap, right? And again, there's also a large literature which has bloomed in the last 15 years on the political economy of not only immigration, but also asylum. And it makes sense. It's a very political salient issue, especially in high-income countries, and it's shaped public discourse and policy, right? There's been some papers out there that have found increased political backlash. So refugee and immigrant flows increase support for anti-immigrant or populist right parties, and we heard from Professor Beer earlier about this as well. The backlash tends to be stronger where migrants are perceived as culturally distant, in transitory routes or in rural areas. And there's been some research showing also that immigration can change policy preference. It can lower natives or the hosts' preference for redistribution and diversity. So Alberto Alesina, who's no longer here, but many of his co-authors have done a lot of work in this area of immigration and redistribution. So when we try to understand then what are the drivers of public attitudes? What is happening sort of like with the public in terms of how they see or perceive immigration and refugee migration particularly? So we found that there's papers showing that a lot of the evidence tends to favor cultural concerns, identity, cohesion, fairness, deservingness. Many of these are words that come from also from my political scientist colleagues and sociologists, right? The idea of deservingness, whether the other is as deserving as I am to have access to the welfare system or not. they tend to be the greater drivers of attitudes. Although material concerns or economic concerns still matter for certain subsets of the host country citizens. For example, working class backgrounds or those in direct competition with migrants, these would drive their public attitudes toward migration. But what we've learned from that literature as well is about the role of misperceptions. And what we've seen is that locals often overestimate, for example, the number of migrants and welfare use. If you ask people how many migrants are there in the country, they're going to tend to grossly overestimate the amount of people or the migrants that are in the country or the amount of refugees that are in the country. And this is obviously amplified by political entrepreneurs. But also, locals also often understate migrant fiscal contribution, despite this being neutral or positive in the case of economic migrants. There's still concerns about generous welfare state attracting migrants, despite the policies in place, right? There is this idea of the welfare magnet or the welfare magnet hypothesis. There's still this idea that perhaps is welfare generosity, what is driving sort of migrants and refugees to go to specific countries. Just to remind you that this is without having the specifics of the policies in place. One example is in the UK, right? Every migrant in the UK, until they reach settled status, they're under what's called the UK non-recourse for public funds. So within the first 5 years, they have no access to the welfare state whatsoever. Only after 5 years, they've paid their way in, right? And then the public does not necessarily know these things. They do not necessarily know about this. But what about the global south? And here I'll tell you a little bit of the work, some of the work that I've been doing in the last 3 or 4 years, which is looking at Colombia, where I'm originally from. So some of my work has been mostly about the UK or East Africa. And in the last 5 years, I finally decided that it was time for me to study my own country, which has been quite excited, but there's always this idea of positionality. As a Colombian, I never really wanted to do too much research about Colombia, but I feel like I've detached myself enough to try to have a sensible approach on how I study these things. And there's been really interesting research already going on. So the space for me as an economist and as a researcher was very narrow. There's been amazing economists doing labor market impacts, fiscal, all sorts of interventions of what works and what doesn't. And I found that there was still space to try to understand the political economy of this, because if you look at both Colombia and Peru, they both have had a sudden increase of Venezuelan migrants in the last almost 10 years or so. Colombia currently hosts 2.8 million Venezuelan migrants, Peru about 1.6 million. And what's interesting is that different from high-income countries, these migrants are culturally similar, same language, religiously very similar, ethnically very similar. A Venezuelan can almost pass as a Colombian. It might be more difficult when they go to Peru, but it's still the case that they're very similar. So this cultural bias is removed from here, which lends itself for an interesting study of what drives attitudes towards migration and what drives policy preferences. And the key in here is that there's still evidence of discrimination, right? There's lots of reports of discrimination towards Venezuelans, both in Peru and Colombia. And the Inter-American Development Bank, for example, has been pushing for a lot of research on this because they can face discrimination not only in access to services, but also in access to the labor market. I think one point that is quite important for me to say here as well is that Colombia had a very open approach at the macro level towards Venezuelan migrants. So there's been an amnesty where basically as long as you're registered as Venezuelan migrant, you're given access to the formal sector, you're given access to public services and so on. In Peru, it's been a little bit different, but it's still, there's still been openness in terms of that. So what I'm going to show you is the results of 2 large conjoint experimental surveys that we ran in 2021 to try to understand policy preferences and attitudes towards migrants, both in Colombia and Peru. Each of these had about 2,000, we interviewed about 2,000 people for each, so about 4,000 for each of the aspects, policy preferences and attitudes towards migrants. I'm not going to bore you with the technicalities of this, because if I go in there, I know economists are going to start picking on a lot of the technical aspects, and I'm really happy to talk about it in another time. But for now, bear with me, and these are some of our findings. And some we already have in papers, some others we're still working on. So when we look at migrant preferences, we run a very similar conjoint survey to what's been done by political scientists for a long time. What determines, what are the drivers of preferences for admissions, right? If I'm a Colombian, what are the drivers of me, for me sort of wanting to admit a Venezuelan migrant? And we included race because it was the closer thing that we had to cultural differences. Still very contentious that we would say that, but we don't see that much pulling in there. Where we see the most pull is on what we've seen in high-income countries. Obviously, people prefer high-skilled migrants, right? Those without university education are preferred to those without university education. Those with occupations that are seen as more skilled are also preferred. But where most differences we tend to find is when we look at work status, right? People prefer those migrants that are being able to work, but not only work, but also work in the formal sector. There's a much more preference for that. And in terms of the migration reason, for those that came to try to find a job or for family reunification. We also look at policy preferences. And what we find in here is that access to employment, if you look at the first panel, access to employment is the #1 pulling factor in terms of policy preferences. Just to remind you, these are Colombians thinking about policy preferences towards Venezuelan migrants. And what we did is we presented them with packages of policies. Instead of just giving them a one-liner policy, we presented a lot of different policies to try to see what were the main drivers. And access to employment came as the first one. And interestingly, it comes on the ways that at the beginning POSL does, right? With unrestricted access to work and some access to work being more preferred to no access to work, right? So Colombians preferring Venezuelans that are going to be, Venezuelans to be able to work in the host country. There's also some of the main difference in terms of family reunification, with conditional family reunification being preferred to other forms of family reunification. Basically, if they can afford to bring their family, we're happy to have them here. We did try to look at some moderators, and we look at trust in government and interpersonal trust, and some of the interesting findings in here were that when you look at trust in government, more trust in government was associated with more liberal policies, but only in terms of labor markets and in terms of numerical caps, right? It was very specific to those two types of policies, whereas when looking at interpersonal trust, and then in here, I'm happy to talk at another point about all the technical aspects of how we measure this, we see that the higher interpersonal trust in migrants, meaning like more quality contact with migrants, led to more preference for more liberal policies in all aspects that we looked at. Protection, health, location, numerical caps, labor markets, and family reunification. So just focusing and narrowing down to the evidence for refugees and asylum seekers, what we've found in the overall literature is that while cultural distance matters, there are factors that also moderate attitudes, right? And this includes humanitarian deservingness or humanitarian values. In another paper that we also had, for example, those that were seeing the Venezuelan situation as a humanitarian crisis rather than an economic crisis were more likely to prefer more liberal policies towards migrants. Martin Ruiz, from which you're going to be hearing about tomorrow, and Bansack and Müller, some political scientists, have also found that consistent asylum stories and vulnerable groups received stronger support. Contact and interpersonal trust seem to matter as moderators of attitudes and policy preferences. Frequent personal contact, and this is frequent personal contact meaning sort of more quality type of interaction, reduces the weight placed on nationality and increases support. Demographic exposure alone does not change preference, right? And if anything, it can backfire. And higher levels of interpersonal trust are associated with more positive attitudes. Trust in institutions, so my own work looking at trust in government is associated with increased acceptance not only to refugees, but to specific policies. And again, as you'll see tomorrow from Martin, you'll hear tomorrow from Martin, he's done some work before on how trust in institutions also matter, particularly in the case of Europe, trust in the EU, and in the case of the further south, trust in UNHCR. And policy design matters as well, right? Transparent rules, numerical limits, clear eligibility conditions, and so on. The question is how informed is the public, right? How do we trust that the public is informed enough about this policy design? So I did tell Matthias that I speak very fast, so hopefully I've not gone through super fast, but I wanted to end this conversation thinking about our role as economists. And as I was doing the presentation, the first thing that came to my mind was we have that discourse gap. We have our findings as economists, very, very strong evidence on labor market impacts, on outcomes, on the policy levers that help for better integration. We know that most of these refugees are hosted in middle-income countries, right? But even in middle-income countries, some of these findings that we talked about also apply. But when we look at the narrative that's out there, and Matthias and Professor Berf were talking about this earlier, we still see, to this day, headlines on welfare misuse or taking up jobs. And then my question was, is there a role that we as economists need to play in bridging that gap between the evidence and the public discourse? And if so, what and how should we do it? I think this is a little unfair because I don't have the answer. I'm in a school of government, and I do sort of pride myself to try to reach out to institutions and communicate the evidence, but it doesn't seem to work enough. So I think it is really important to continue work on understanding what works in moderating attitudes. And again, I've seen some of the papers presented in these conferences. In this conference are working on this, looking at attitudes towards migration. There's been a lot of recent work on trying to do initiatives like providing information, sort of trying to inform the public, perspective taking, intergroup contact. Many of these interventions are really interesting, but the question is, are they scalable enough? Can they be scaled? How do we make them broader? And do they necessarily reach the ones that we need them to reach? It's very hard to say, right? So that's my main point of sort of my lecture today, sort of our role as economists in communicating the evidence and bridging that gap. And there were other considerations that I needed to bring here that I think that are important, and it's importance of nuance. We live in a world of headlines, and we live in a world where the sort of headlines news need to be sort of pointed. Whenever I've worked for, like, with international institutions, NGOs, or sort of other actors, they want the headline. They want a very specific headline, which is very hard for us to be able to sort of just put it out there, because it can miscommunicate a lot of other things. And this is another question to which I don't have the answer, but is the importance of nuance and how we convey nuance to the public, right? But also in the way we do research. We talk about migration, but migration is a very big thing, right? So reason to migrate matters. We often sort of look at the statistics of migration, but we don't necessarily look enough, unless you're a migration economist, to whether there's student migrants, economic migrants, forced migrants, and so on. So reason for migration matters. Understanding policies in place matter as well. We still see papers on the welfare magnet impacts, for example, knowing that a lot of the high-income countries have policies in place that do not allow migrants to access the welfare state for at least 5 years. So it is important for us as economists to sort of think about this policy context in which we're moving in, but also understanding attitudes towards different migration policies, right? Many of the earlier work tended to look at survey questions that would be on the form of, do you think migration is too high or too low, right? But is that enough? Is that the only policy? And this is the work that I've been trying to do lately, and Martin Ruiz, who's talking tomorrow, has been working on this space a lot, on the multi-dimensional nature of policies, right? If we look at different types of policies and try to understand what drives the public's anxiety, it would be much easier then to communicate the message on how these things work. And let me finish with 2 more things that I need deserve more attention by researchers, and that I wish I could do if I had more time. It's the need for more research on migration and the role of informality. As I mentioned, a large percent of forced migrants are in middle-income countries. These countries, by default, have very large informal sectors. In the case of Colombia, for example, interestingly, they've been given access to formal work, but they still remain in the informal sector. The question is why. And I have my insights as to why this might be, but I'd love to see more research on this. Even in high-income countries, you see a tendency of forced migrants to engage more on self-employment. And why? Why is this happening? What's behind this? It's something that I think deserves more attention. But also more research is needed, focused on disaster-related displacement, and paying more attention to what's happening to these countries that have been more prone to natural disasters, what's happening with these displaced people, and what are the impacts of this displacement on those that have been displaced. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel, really for this tour de force through the economics and politics of forced migration, really synthesizing a lot of research that has been done by yourself and many others in the field.